elements to the exhibition, but I'm going to let our co-curators Jim Higginbotham and Sean Burrus tell you about them. Before I introduce Jim and Sean, I want also to extend an invitation to everyone back to the museum after the lecture to see the exhibition and to enjoy a refreshment with us. Jim Higginbotham is the Associate Professor of Classics and the Curator of the Ancient Collection at the museum. He has played a vital role in illuminating the ancient world to those on campus, in the community, and well beyond. His scholarly interests focus on ancient Greece and Roman colonies, as well as the social history of the late Roman Republic. In addition to teaching courses in archaeology and classical languages, he has excavated on classical sites in Israel, Greece, and Italy. In Italy, where he has been the field director of the joint University of Michigan Bowdoin College excavation at Pestum from 1993 to the present. Sean Burrus is in his second year as the Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral curatorial fellow at the museum. His PhD is from the Department of Religion at Duke University. Sean's research considers the role of art and artifacts in mediating cultural contact in the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, with a particular focus on marginalized and migrant communities on the borders of empire. Sean also serves with great distinction as the liaison between the Bowdoin faculty and the museum, supporting faculty use of the collections for teaching, research, and exhibitions. Prior to arriving at Bowdoin, Sean held research fellowships at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and at the University of Michigan. Again, we're so proud to be here, that you are here today, and without further delay, please welcome Jim Higginbotham and Sean Burrus.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you to all of you for joining us this evening to celebrate the opening of Assyria to America. Our plan for the talk tonight is, in some ways, to mirror their exhibition by sharing with you a series of brief snapshots, walking through the history, the very long history of these reliefs from the first millennium before the Common Era to the present day. But first, I'd like to say a few words of thanks of my own, which could easily take up the entire lecture, so I will keep them as brief as possible. But as you may know, an exhibition is the work of many, many, many hands. And in addition to amazing support on so many fronts from a wonderful museum team, this exhibition has benefited in particular from the efforts of two Bowdoin students who I'd like to single out tonight. This summer, Bowdoin sophomore Ayub Talil carried out some really fantastic research on the ivories that you'll see in the exhibition and prepared the labels for those pieces, as well as assisting us with some digital imaging on the Bowdoin reliefs. Ayub is presenting on some of his work tomorrow in the Summer Research Symposium. This fall, Brooke Rubel, a Bowdoin junior, joined the exhibition team in its last push and has been absolutely instrumental in helping design case layouts and in creating much of the digital content that you'll be able to explore in the exhibition. We're so fortunate to have wonderful students like these at Bowdoin, and I just want to say how grateful I am to Ayub and to Brooke, who is here this evening, for their tremendous work on Assyria to America. Of course, I'd also like to thank my co-curator, Professor Jim Higginbotham, who has been the best possible collaborator for this exhibition and brought to the project a long-standing care and commitment to the reliefs at Bowdoin and a deep knowledge of their history. Jim?
Thank you very much, Sean. I also want to echo the pleasure it has been to work with Sean on this exhibition, and again, to benefit from his excitement about these artifacts that we've been around for such a long time and help to really kind of invigorate a new kind of study. I also want to just single out with the museum staff, which Sean mentioned, are vital and instrumental to the success of the show. In particular, I'd like to, just to single out Suzanne Bergeron, who, put up with all of our texts and labels and things like this and helped format a lot that went on the walls. Jose Ribas, many of you probably know, and his kind of collaborator, Joe Haluska, who have, worked together to help kind of really physically put the exhibition together. And lastly, we have some great colleagues from academic technology, David Israel, who I think might be here tonight, and David Francis and Paul Benham, who have done amazing things that I hope you'll be able to appreciate when we go over to the gallery later today, later this evening. So I get to start off, and as Sean was indicating, this is a kind of a tag team presentation, where what we hope to do is briefly kind of outline different kind of components. And I'm going to start off by doing in just a few minutes what should take an entire course, and just to kind of step us back into history to think about some themes and some elements of ancient Assyria that might be worth us keeping in mind as we begin to look at the exhibition more broadly. Assyrian history is in many places in the ancient world by modern scholars has been divided up into kind of tripartite, three-part chunks. And so there's an old Assyria, there's actually an early, but there's an old Assyria, there's a middle Assyria, and then there's new Assyria or Neo-Assyria. And that's the period that we're focused on really with our exhibition. Neo-Assyria begins right at the tail end of the 10th century BCE and continues down towards the last decade or so of the 7th. It was, at its time, the world's largest empire. And it was a multi-ethnic state that was centered in a number of cities in the upper part of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, but extended far and wide into what is now Turkey today, across some of the tumultuous borders that we think of, and even for a time down into the 7th century had included Egypt as part of its empire. The Assyrians were known in antiquity and are celebrated by themselves in their own art as being foremost in warcraft. And this is something that helped Assyrian kings accumulate wealth that would generate the artifacts and architecture that we'll begin to appreciate. And it's very descriptive art that are recorded on these reliefs that we find scattered in many, many parts of the world today, including the United States, and we will talk more about that a little bit later. This is a relief of an Assyrian army attacking a city with battering rams and archers and dealing with captives in typical fashion. The Assyrians, or also the kings, helped celebrate their prowess not just by conquering real estate and conquering peoples, but by choreographed, probably, displays of valor that involved hunts. And these are a way of communicating the special status of a king and are reflected in the art that they represent. And lions are a persistent theme as we look across the ancient world and think about how that epitomizes a certain kind of elevated status over which the king would prevail. They also were known for the constructors of great palaces and edifices that we find in the Assyrian world, and principally around their palaces, which I'll say something briefly about. They were quite graphic and also descriptive in the details of how they move big blocks to distant places in order to put them up into place, including, as you'll see even on this particular image, this is a drawing because the original relief in the British Museum is in a very dark place and it doesn't really come out well, but a Lamassu figure, one of these human-headed bulls, sometimes human-headed lions, a statue that we'll see more of a little bit later, that being kind of dragged on a sled towards its site. The focus, though, of our exhibition really centers on one particular king, Assur-Nasir-Pal II. And Assur-Nasir-Pal II is one of the earliest kings of this new Assyrian empire. And he's ruling in the 9th century BCE, comes to the throne in probably the year 883, and rules for quite a long time. He's really the first Assyrian king to decorate a palatial building with carved reliefs, as we see. So when you look at our reliefs here at Bowdoin College and think about it, those are those first important steps that the Assyrians begin to use to demonstrate their status in the ancient world. Assur-Nasir-Pal had the opportunity to set up a new capital, and he actually goes to a dilapidated town. In fact, you'll be able to read in a translation of the standard inscription how Assur-Nasir-Pal talks about it. He finds a dilapidated town and then kind of embellishes it, turns it into something quite special. Has a big celebratory banquet with tens of thousands of visitors that lasted for a long time, and they killed a lot of animals. It was a great feast just to celebrate the setting up of this particular architectural palace. And so here you see an aerial view of this palace as it sits very close to the Tigris River. And the ancient name Kalu, the more contemporary name Nimrud, which is probably better known, is today at Tel, and we'll find out more about its more recent history in a moment. And this palace was decorated with fine reliefs that were painted, and that's something that we have to kind of get into our mind to think about the reliefs that we see, and part of our exhibition is devoted to that. And so we actually have some parts that are illuminated so you can get a hint of what was done on the inside. But what we don't often see, and this is really the beauty of what we have up on display today, are the kinds of artifacts that would have been inside the palace. And we have examples of ivory inlays of furniture. We have an entire back of a chair done in ivory. That just shows you the kind of the small scale art, but one that really does bear a close relationship to the more magnificent art that we see in architecture. It also reveals to us some very interesting aspects of the end of Assyrian history. So one of the pieces in the collection, a lion head, is made of ivory, but it's been burned. At the end of the 7th century, the Assyrian Empire becomes the victim of some of their own subjects. And so the Medes, who live in what is now kind of northern Iran, Babylonians in the southern part of the Tigris-Euphrates, form a coalition of peoples that overrun the important cities of Assyria. And by the year 610 or so, the Assyrian Empire, the new Assyrian Empire, is no more. One of the more interesting reliefs we have in our collection that many of you probably know is one that has been defaced. It's been mutilated, that took place at the time when this palace was being sacked by the Medes and the Babylonians at the end of the 7th century. And then at the end of all of this, the site was abandoned. Eventually, people moved away, and it lay as a mound sitting out in the plains around the Tigris River for another time, for a time of rediscovery.
Thank you, Jim. And that's what I want to talk with you briefly about here, is the modern discovery of the site at Nimrud. And the image that you just saw is really how it stood until the middle of the 19th century. And our story really begins with this good British chap here, Austin Henry Layard. Now, everything that we read about Layard suggests that he was an exceptionally bright and also an exceptionally impulsive young fellow. He even goes so far as to describe himself as, and I quote, very idle, self-willed, and troublesome boy. He was schooled in Britain, but he never seems to have completed any sort of regular course of studies. He trained as a solicitor, but rather than take up a job as a lawyer, and in 1939, at the ripe old age of 22, he and a companion hatch a grand scheme to travel through the Ottoman Empire. Now, his travels over the course of the next 3 years take him through Turkey and Syria and eventually to Mesopotamia. And his description of this period in his life suggests that he was really having a grand old time of it. He describes floating leisurely down the Tigris, going out shooting every evening for their evening meal and cooking it on the banks of the Tigris River. A grand old time. And he's also clearly falling in love with the region, though, at the same time. One can easily detect this in his writings. And he's beginning to formulate future plans for himself. The turning point in our story comes in the spring of 1840, when in Mesopotamia, Layard first encounters the mounds of Nimrud and other ancient Assyrian sites around the city of Mosul, which was then the capital of an Ottoman province. Layard describes the encounter as follows. These huge mounds of Assyria made a deeper impression upon me, gave rise to more serious thought and more earnest reflection than the temples of Baalbek in Syria or the theaters of Ionia in Turkey. My curiosity had been greatly excited, and from that time I formed the design of thoroughly examining, whenever it might be in my power, these singular ruins. This is 1840. And it has to be remembered that in 1840, very, very, very little is known about ancient Assyria. Very little is known with any concrete detail. In fact, all of the material culture that had thus been found of Assyria fit into a single 3-foot by 3-foot case in the British Museum, and had arrived there only a few decades earlier through the work of a previous British traveler in the region, Claudius James Rich, who was in Mesopotamia in 1820. So exceptionally little was known when Austin Henry Layard was traveling in 1840 in Mesopotamia. He could scarcely imagine what he would find in a few short years. Well, anyway, after his travels, in 1842, Layard ends up in Istanbul, where he serves as the unofficial aide to the British ambassador, who is Sir Stratford Canning. And the two of them cook up a scheme, which is no doubt mostly down to Layard himself. One imagines him being rather persistent on this front, to send Layard back to Mesopotamia to investigate these ancient mounds that he had encountered in his earlier travels. There's an air of uncertainty that accompanies the entire endeavor, and Canning devotes only £60 to Layard's travel expenses and an additional monthly stipend of £20. These are very, very modest sums, even in that day, that could hardly undertake a major exhibition. And there's an air of secrecy to it as well. And that's captured in a memorandum that we have preserved from Sir Stratford Canning that details the agreement that he and Layard made. And that agreement includes a number of points, but number 4 of which is that Layard should bear in mind that his professed occupation will be that of a traveler, fond of antiquities, of picturesque scenery, and of manners peculiar to Asia. Now, if the shoe fits, at this point, acting in this way was something of old hat to Layard. He'd been traveling and doing this already for 3 years. So the disguise was an easy one for Layard to take on. And so he sets off in 1845, and he arrives in Mosul. And he records that on the 8th of November in 1845, having secretly procured a few tools, I engaged a mason at the moment of my departure, and carrying with me a variety of guns, spears, and other formidable weapons, declared that I was going to hunt wild boars in a neighboring village, and floated down the Tigris on a small raft, constructed for my journey. So he sets off here with a very tiny party of four other people in order to not attract attention to his journey. And he's riding on what's called a kelek, a little raft that's constructed of goat skins lashed to a wooden frame, for a 5-hour journey down the Tigris to the site of Nimrud. Now, this very small team met with success on their very first day of excavations on the 9th of November, when Layard and his team uncovered a pair of rooms in 2 separate palaces, each of which was lined with carved gypsum slabs, such as we see today. Now, the discoveries of that very first day were predictive of the great success that was to come and the extraordinary richness of the mound of Nimrud. In the first week alone, he found still more reliefs and ivories. In the first month, he found his first colossal Lamassu figures. And by the end of the first season, just a few short months of excavation, Layard had found more than a dozen rooms at the site of Nimrud that were filled with carved gypsum slabs, ivories, and 9 pairs of monumental figures. And I thought I'd share with you just one of the descriptions from Layard's later accounts that really testifies to the continual sense of awe and wonder that accompanied the excavations. Remember, very little was known of Assyria at this time. Layard writes on the discovery, this records the first discovery of a Lamassu figure. This gigantic head, blanched with age, thus rising from the bowels of the earth, might well have belonged to one of those fearful beings which are pictured in the traditions of the country, as appearing to mortals, slowly ascending from the regions below. One of the workmen catching sight of the monster had thrown down his basket and run off towards Mosul as fast as his legs could carry him. Layard's also a great writer, and his later accounts, we'll speak just briefly in a minute, do a good job of popularizing his finds. But when accounts of such discoveries like these, which seem almost a daily occurrence at Nimrud, reached Canning and others, they prompted a lot of attention and fairly quickly support from prominent corners. So after that first season of excavations, Stratford Canning writes to Sir Robert Peel, who is then the Prime Minister of Britain, and he writes, "On the banks of the Tigris, not far from Mosul, there is a gigantic mound called Nimrud. My agent has succeeded in opening it here and there, and his labors have been rewarded by the discovery of many interesting sculptures and a world of inscriptions. If the excavation keeps its promise to the end, there is much reason to hope that Montague House will beat the Louvre hollow." I really like that last line that you all chuckled at, and I suspect you know why, because it attests to a sort of an air of international competition and Anglo-French rivalry that accompanied excavations in this time period. Montague House is the name for the British Museum in this time period. And so what Canning is doing is he's appealing to Sir Robert Peel's good British pride that Britain needs to be first among the European nations in discovering ancient Assyria. Now, with the support of prominent people like Stratford Canning and Sir Robert Peel, the British Museum took up the charge and funded Layard's future excavations at the site. And it is because of this support of the excavations that the British Museum came to house the largest single collection of these reliefs and other Assyrian antiquities outside of Iraq. Now, the transport of these monumental sculptures, which are captured here in a series of illustrations, mostly from Layard's volumes, is no easy feat. The slabs themselves weigh over a ton apiece, and the Lamassu figures many times that. And the process was recorded in a series of illustrations that you see here in Layard's, where they used a massive amount of manpower to lift these figures from the site, draw them to the banks of the Tigris, and then float them down to Basra on a giant kelek, an oversized kelek that Layard designed using over 400 goat skins, down to Basra, where they were then shipped by steamer to the British Museum, which you see here. And just one more note, though. It would be very hard to underestimate how groundbreaking Layard's excavations were. And not only did they significantly advance our knowledge of Assyrian culture and history, they also captured the public imagination in Europe. Layard has to be given credit for realizing the importance of what he had and being savvy about making the most of it. He was quick to press, something that many archaeologists today cannot say. And still in the midst of his excavations, he dug on the site until 1850. He released in 1849 two major publications. One of them that you see here is a monumental a folio of 100 lavishly illustrated plates called the Monuments of Nineveh. And the other was a 2-volume popular account of his excavations called Nineveh and Its Remains, which really was a bestseller and was sold even at railway stations throughout Britain. And just a note here before I pass on, they're described as Nineveh because at the time, everybody was racing to find Nineveh. And Layard hoped that at Nimrud, he had found Nineveh. Nineveh was the most famous storied of Assyrian sites. It was one of the longest capitals of the period. And Layard hoped that Nimrud was the site of Nineveh. Now, just a few short years after this publication, they realized that Nimrud was actually Kalhu, not actually Nineveh, and that Layard had discovered Nineveh at the site of Koyunjik, just a few kilometers to the north, but had gotten a mix-up. And perhaps in this rush to publication, he was a little quick to pinpoint the location. But Jim.
Well, it's interesting to think about the misnomer of Nineveh and Nimrud, and it actually persists for a very long time, even though, as Sean noted, that Layard realized and the mix-up pretty soon after the publications. Nimrud was called Nineveh for quite a long time. The excitement, though, that we see generated by the travel of these reliefs, and sculptures to the UK, but also a parallel story can be told about France as well. And part of that international competition did make Assyrian culture and Assyrian art kind of an international phenomenon, and being able to possess and to appreciate this particular aspect of what many people saw as biblical culture was very, very important. And you can see that beyond the publications, of which we have some of a copy of the popular version on display in our exhibition, the London Illustrated News also did a series of this, that looked at the history of how these things, the engineering feat of how these huge stones were moved, floated down the Tigris and into and make their way to other places. And the celebration was enhanced more by the prominent place that the British Museum, the Louvre as well, gave these new sculptures as they come in. So this is just a picture of that Lamassu figure that we looked at earlier, being kind of floated down the Tigris. And it made a name for Henry Layard, Sir Austin Henry Layard, that translated into the trafficking of examples of Assyrian art, not only within kind of elite circles in Britain, but also eventually to the United States. This is a great picture. This is of Layard's wife, Enid, and you can see in the painting there, she's wearing this jewelry, which actually is a kind of a composite of artifacts and seals and things like that came from the excavations. And so the popularization of Assyrian art creates a certain kind of Assyriana kind of collecting, fervor in the 19th century that eventually is going to help propel it into the United States. And so this, many of you have been to the British Museum before, and not going to go through and show you, but yet this kind of display is what you see in just one of the main prominent galleries of the hundreds of reliefs that were removed in the course of the 19th century, really beginning with these important European capitals, but eventually moving to the United States. And so Here is an example of a Lamassu figure that's in the University of Chicago, the Oriental Institute Museum. Williams College got one of the first reliefs in New England. Again, you know, procured by an alum who happened to be in the region. And that is a very kind of similar story that we have here to tell at Bowdoin. This is just a kind of a cursory list of some of the places that where these reliefs now exist. You can see how many of them are in the United States, including Bowdoin College, the Hood Museum at Dartmouth, just to name a few, the LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and the Walters Art Museum, and others, so that you can go to these places and see a little snippet of the reliefs that come from the palace at Kowloon. For Bowdoin, though, it is a fascinating story. And so it really begins with a letter that you see here that was written by a former Bowdoin student. He was a medical school student, Henry Byron Haskell, to one of his professors, and Professor Parker Cleveland. The Cleveland Hall is named after him. And Parker Cleveland's a whole nother kind of interesting story, a geologist, but someone who was much of a polymath and was very interested in and active with the medical school. But Haskell writes to Cleveland during a time when he is just returned from Mosul and offering the college the 5 reliefs that we have. And so this is in 1857 that this begins, this interesting story of the reliefs on their way to Bowdoin. The Board of Governors and the college met and allocated, and many of you have heard this story before, a whopping sum of $500 to cover the transportation. All other costs would be carried, by Haskell, or they would not be incurred to the college. And so that starts a journey where very much parallel to the way that the reliefs made their way to London, being floated down the Tigris, arriving at Basra in the Shatt al-Arab, in the mouth of the river, and then being put on a boat for the voyage over to India, where it looped into the bigger circuit of the East India Company and then make its way to places in the United States. And so this began, and we begin to see some interesting tales. I mean, evidently the reliefs were floated down the river, but because of the height of the river, they got stuck for almost a year in Basra. So they were kind of there for a while before the ship could take them onto India. All of this Haskell was not aware, but was beginning to kind of tick up the kinds of costs associated with the transportation that the reliefs would have. And so the reliefs, and we have these letters that are preserved where Haskell is surprised to learn that this is happening. He's writing back to the college just to reassure them that he's been told by his agents in Turkish Mesopotamia that they've been held up a little bit, but they're on their way. And he actually discovers it early in 1860 that this is happening. In the course of that year, they finally arrive. And when they first arrive, they actually come in under budget. And there's a kind of an excitement. So it comes in, $300 and change. But by suddenly the bills start trickling in, added things. And evidently, the initial cost only included the going down to Basra and not the other parts of the trip. And so another bill comes subsequent to that, so that in the end, the bill on arrival was $728 and change rather than the $500 that was allocated. But though it's unclear the exact deliberations, the college did end up, paying for the reliefs that we have today. This is just a little photo of a very young Parker Cleveland. I can't find something of Haskell yet for us to look at. So they come to the college, and they're, you know, at a time, again, in 1860, the time of the American Civil War, where they have a home in library at the college at the time, and eventually are form a part of the collection that was kept in the Bowdoin Chapel. We actually, and then it will be much later that the reliefs will make their way into their present home in the Walker Art Museum, or now the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. You can see in some of the old photographs, though, of this journey. This is actually a installation picture of the art collection in the Bowdoin Chapel. You can see the rows of paintings kind of hanging out, looming over you. But you'll notice right in the back, you know, hard to see in the photograph, one of our Assyrian reliefs. When they were finally moved to the Walker Art Museum, they eventually found a home in the rotunda. And for a time, you can see this is a relief. It kind of nestled behind the gift shop. And many of you probably remember that at the time. But it did not offer them the exposure that we're hoping to do now, and have, you know, begun the effort to do with changes in display. That really began in the renovations of the museum that took place now, back in 2006, and finished in 2007. This shows you one of the reliefs as it was moved, had been moved from the rotunda and is stuck up in what is now the Assyrian Gallery, which you'll get to see today, being positioned in the steel cages behind that hold the reliefs in place, behind the walls that are there now. And the movement of the reliefs is very interesting. It's almost parallel to the way that the Assyrians moved stones. We actually had to build a sled and put them on the sled, and the chunks that were cut were movable, but they still weighed. Some of them, and I can give you some of the exact measurements, but they were in excess almost of 1,000 kilos. And so there was the largest piece that was almost a ton that was moved. And they were then carefully moved off the walls and into place. And it's interesting just to keep in mind that the pieces that you'll see in the museum have been sawed so that they're in bite-sized chunks. And they've been trimmed off at the back, so they're about half to a third of their original thickness, just to make it more easier to move. Now, it's very hard to see, but when we were pulling these stones apart, it was kind of very interesting. And I have a better image of this in the exhibition. But the undersides are actually painted with the address labels. So they mention, Professor Cleveland, Brunswick, USA, and then in the bottom of this particular relief, and I'm sorry that this is so dark, but it actually has the word America, so that was written in ink, and so it is an important kind of story that's repeated in many places across New England. But it is our own story of how our reliefs begin to make their way, and eventually to their present home in the Assyrian Gallery, which now is really just the opening for our exhibition that you'll be seeing in a few moments.
Yeah. So with this final snapshot, what I want to do is bring it up to the present. And particularly, I want to describe for you briefly two major events that have happened in Iraq in the recent past, and some of the responses to those events. The first notable event, and I really should say that these are two very tragic events, occurred in April of 2003. When over the space of just a few very short days, over 15,000 objects were looted from the galleries and the storerooms of the Iraq National Museum in Baghdad. Many thousands of these objects were actually from Nimrud. And this happened in the wake of American and British coalition forces reaching Baghdad on April 9th. And in the ensuing chaos, the coalition forces and Iraqi forces were engaged within blocks of the Iraq Museum. From April 10th through the 12th, 4 days, this looting took place. The photos that you see here show the scenes that the museum staff arrived to when they were able to get back into the building on April 13th. Now, many of the objects that were looted made their way to the black market. Some made their way to New York and have since been recovered, but well under half of those objects have been recovered so far. And it's taken 12 years for the museum to even reopen, which it did in 2015. But really, one has to ask how does a country and a museum really recover from such unprecedented looting? Now, in the same year that the Iraq Museum reopened in 2015, another devastating event happened to Assyrian heritage. And that was that ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, which had captured the site of Nimrud in 2014, using pickaxes, jackhammers, saws, sledgehammers, bulldozers, and explosives, absolutely decimated the site, and the many reliefs, about half of which remained on site at Nimrud. They distributed a video of the destruction, which is heart-wrenching to watch, and you see stills from that video here. Now, ISIS targets cultural heritage in this way for many reasons, but I'll point out two. The first, and the explanation that you would get from ISIS themselves, is that places like Nimrud fall under the category of shirk. That is, that they are idolatrous sites, and idolatry is the one unforgivable sin in Islam. Bear in mind, though, that these sites are dearly loved and of vital importance to the local communities around them, who see them as an integral part of their history. So destroying them also inflames local sectarian tensions, which ISIS hopes to use to its advantage, divide and conquer. But the terrorists are also aware that such actions bring global attention and grab headlines across the world. Now, these two events, the looting of the Iraq Museum and the destruction of Nimrud, have occasioned a number of responses from many different corners, and I want to share just a few of those with you as well. Starting in 2008, the Smithsonian Institute undertook a collaboration with Iraqi antiquities professionals and founded the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage. That's an ongoing project that continues to this day, where members of various teams at the Smithsonian are working in Erbil in northern Iraq to train Iraqi colleagues in museum practices and conservation so that they can be involved in the recovery efforts in response to events like the destruction of Nimrud and the looting of the Iraq Museum. Most recently, in 2017, a $400,000 grant was awarded by the State Department for the Nimrud Rescue Project, which is working on site specifically in response to the destruction of Nimrud, with the Smithsonian partnering with Iraqi colleagues in the field. And I was in DC last month speaking with some of the Smithsonian team involved on site, and getting really the most up-to-date report that I'd heard yet about what is actually at the site of Nimrud. And what I learned is that they're many years away from getting to the point of even being able to plan the rebuild. They're at the point right now of literally picking up the pieces around the site and haven't even gotten to the central buildings. Because what happened when the Islamic State blew up the site is that the concrete superstructure of the archaeological site was a fantastic tourist destination that a lot of money and attention and care had been put into. The concrete superstructure collapsed, and before they can lift that superstructure and find out what, if anything, remains, they have to find out whether or not it's booby-trapped, which apparently has been done at sites before. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm happy to share with you that in the spring, we'll have a lecture featuring some of the members of the Smithsonian team. So please join us again for that, and plan to come back and learn more directly from them. But also, I want to note that these destructions and devastating events have occasioned artistic responses as well. And I'll single out the work of Michael Rakowitz, who we are very fortunate to be able to include in the exhibition. Michael Rakowitz is an Iraqi Jewish artist who grew up in Brooklyn. And I was speaking to him last winter, and he related the tale to me of his parents had immigrated from Iraq. And he told me the story of how growing up as a boy in Brooklyn, his mother would take him to the Brooklyn Museum, and she would sit him down in front of the Brooklyn Museum's reliefs from Nimrud, and she would say, "This is your heritage." And for him, it was also, he saw it as the world's first comic book. But nonetheless, it played an important role in his upbringing as a diaspora Iraqi. And so the loss and the looting of Iraq, of the Iraq Museum, and the destruction of Nimrud were deeply felt by Michael Rakowitz and by many other members of the diaspora Iraqi community as well. So in 2007, Michael began a new project called The Invisible Enemy Shall Not Exist, in which he has taken descriptions of the ancient artifacts that were looted from the Iraq Museum, 15,000 of them, and he has combined these with modern Middle Eastern packaging materials to recreate the ancient artifacts. And we have a series of these in the exhibition that we're very excited, based on Nimrud ivories mostly, that we're really excited to be able to include. Because Michael's work really, the combination of ancient artifact and modern material really prompts us to think deeply about our connection to the past. In 2016, in response to the ongoing civil war in Syria, Michael added another component to this project called May the Obdurate Foe Not Stay in Good Health, which looks at objects that are in peril in Syria. These two projects are open-ended and ongoing. Michael's continuing to work on them today, reflecting the fact that cultural heritage preservation and the looting of the Iraq Museum, we still have not recovered. So Michael sees his projects as an ongoing effort. At Bowdoin, though, we've been engaged in a number of efforts on our own front to increase access to the reliefs and to contribute new research and scholarship. We're excited that we get to bring back a feature that many of you may have already encountered that Professor Higginbotham did in 2017, the polychrome projections on the Assyrian reliefs. Those are back. We invite you to come take a look tonight. And we plan to do another projection this spring, so that'll be an ongoing part of the installation. We also undertook RTI imaging on the reliefs this summer. RTI imaging is an advanced digital technique that allows you to manipulate the light and throw raking light on the reliefs in post-processing. And you can really study the tool marks, you can study the cuneiform inscriptions, you can study various aspects of the preservation of the reliefs as well. And efforts like this are part of us trying to increase access in multiple pathways. We hope that by creating images like these, we might create a resource that will be valuable to colleagues across the world, including in Iraq. Finally, this fall, Jim and I were fortunate enough to go over to the British Museum, where we partnered with colleagues there to image some artifacts in their collection. Including a statue, one of very few 3D Assyrian statues in the round, a statue of the king Ashurnasirpal II that we discovered as we were imaging is now too fragile to go on loan anymore. So it's now at the British Museum, probably on a permanent basis. By 3D imaging it, you'll see, if you go over to the exhibition this evening, you'll see a 3D printed model that Bowdoin's academic technology and consulting, and David Israel, who I think is here, helped us to print, and a virtual model of the statue as well. By 3D imaging of it, we were able to create a new pathway for access. We plan to do 3D imaging of our own reliefs in the coming months and to have those online as well. Last, I want to share with you a really exciting collaboration that we've just recently inaugurated. It's a partnership between Bowdoin College Museum of Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, called the Northwest by Northeast Project. Northwest by Northeast referring, of course, to the Northwest Palace at Nimrud and the northeastern United States, where so many of these reliefs have ended up. And I share here a slide of the partners in that collaboration, each of whom has Assyrian reliefs from Nimrud of their own. Now, as a collaboration, we all of us discovered, we had an inaugural meeting here at Bowdoin in May, and one of the most amazing outcomes of that was just to learn the depth of care that each of these institutions is taking of their reliefs on an ongoing basis. Everybody had something interesting that they had recently done around the Assyrian reliefs to contribute to the discussion. And so as a collaborative, we're hoping to pool those resources, number one, into a database of images and documents that tell the story of how these reliefs came all the way from Nimrud on the Tigris over to the northeastern United States. Documents like those you've seen tonight, letters from Byron Henry Haskell. Most of our institutions have those, and we want to aggregate those together and share those globally. And better tell that story. The other thing we're hoping to do in the fullness of time is create a virtual exhibition that uses the images and the work that we're all doing to tell a story to a public audience of those reliefs.
So we wanted to kind of conclude with something from Sir Austin Henry Layard that kind of sets our minds towards the future, and where he writes, where these Assyrian reliefs, however valuable, such as could be again obtained either by ingenuity or labor, their loss might not perhaps be so seriously lamented. But once destroyed, they can never be restored, and it must be remembered that they are almost the only remains of a great city and of a great nation. So that's what we have, and we thank you for coming. We have some time for some quick questions, but again, thank you very much. There's microphones going around, so.
And I would just say, if we don't get to your question here, do come, there's a reception afterwards, and join us there, and we'll be happy to talk and share the exhibition with you.
Thank you. Since all these artifacts and the reliefs here and elsewhere were removed from another country, all over the place, has the destruction by ISIS and during the Iraq War prompted any discussion about returning some of these, including the ones at Bowdoin, back to Iraq and wherever else, whatever other part of whatever country is now existing?
I'll start with that. If we go back even in time to the Gulf War, when there was the setting up of a kind of an autonomous, semi-autonomous government around Mosul in northern Iraq, which still kind of exists today. There were not so much an effort to get the reliefs returned, but there was an outreach that took place at that time just to kind of discover where things were located. And Sean can say more about this because the recent destruction that happened in northern Iraq has caused many people to begin discussing about where these reliefs would have been safe in one place or the other. So So it is something that's of open debate, because there's a strong feeling, particularly among archaeologists, that cultural patrimony should remain, a vital part of any kind of nation. But as we go through history, and as Sean, has laid out, the reliefs left when there wasn't an Iraq. There was not a country there, which has been more of a kind of European construct after the First World War. But still, the people living there, and also the people who don't live in this part of the world, and there's a great and large Assyrian community in the United States who identify with these works, and many of them can't go back to Mosul to see them. So I think that there's a rich debate to happen around this particular issue.
Yeah, and I think that museums need to play an important role in those discussions that are going to happen. I'll say that right now there's no active discussion. There's no requests from our Iraqi colleagues. What I have seen, on the other hand, is the fact that these reliefs exist around the world has made us all the more attuned to the loss that's happened in Iraq, and all the more eager to find ways to support our colleagues there in efforts to recover, to repair, to restore their cultural heritage. I am a big believer in the promise of a universal museum and the great value that it can contribute to a society. And that's why I hope that museums like Bowdoin and the Met and the British Museum will continue to be at the forefront of those discussions, those difficult conversations that need to happen about cultural heritage and preserving it, and lead efforts in partnership with colleagues in Iraq. Do everything we can to increase access to our reliefs and transparency as well. It's a great question, though, and it's certainly on everybody's mind and worth discussing.
I would just add one point that, and Sean raised this, since the looting of the Baghdad Museum, and it's taken place after Daesh, or the Islamic State, has Daesh, sorry, it's the Arabic, the Islamic State has set up their caliphate, that a lot of the Syrian art has left the country and gone on the market. So there's great vigilance right now to make sure that those, can get back to country.
From the peaks of my ignorance, I have a two-part question. The first has to do with, what do you know about the motives of constructing these gigantic statues? And then, derived from what I just learned from you about the proximity of Nineveh and Nimrud, to what extent were they in competition with each other, perhaps prefiguring the city-states of Greece and other such early political structures?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and again, it gets to the core of how the Assyrian Empire was structured. And you raised the interesting, comparison to the Greek city-states, which were often in competition with one another, through most of their history. What we see in the Neo-Assyrian state is not so much competing cities as a kind of an add-on. So, for instance, if Ashur had been the original capital and with old temples that were venerated, a new leader often would want to establish a more monumental site that didn't have to interfere with pre-existing settlement or architecture. In addition, Kalu is very close to some very important and useful gypsum sites where you can actually quarry the stones to make a palace that's stone decorated in a way that previous palaces were not. And so if there was a competition among, within Assyria, it was often one ruler trying to eclipse another rather than Khorsabad trying to outdo Nineveh, trying to outdo Kalu, because there was still kind of a centralized, bureaucracy in there in the way that the Greek states did not have.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, this is all down to the king trying to demonstrate their power at the heart of a rapidly expanding empire. The Assyrian kings undertook yearly military campaigns to expand their territories. They commanded a massive system of tribute and war spolia, and the palaces were a place to display that. So Ashurnasirpal's founding of Nimrud is really a way of setting himself apart as something new, as the greatest yet to come. And that is something that you see roughly 400 times in the palace, as it's inscribed in the standard inscription across every single slab that records repeats over and over again, 400 repetitions that record Ashurnasirpal, the good king, the great king, the strong king, favorite of the gods, and it goes through all of his accomplishments. And the palace is that writ large. The palace is a place for entertaining. It's a place for bringing emissaries from the far reaches of the empire and from beyond to come and see the might of this king. That's it's the Versailles of its day.
It even had like little museums in some of the earliest places for display, which is an old Near Eastern tradition that goes back. But there's one artifact we have in our exhibition of that burnt lion head that may have come from one of these little storerooms, that where things were kept and exhibited. Part of it.
I'll add to the two other things in the exhibition. There's an ivory chairback in a case. Ashurnasirpal had so much ivory he didn't know what to do with it. It was kept in storerooms. The ivory chairback that's in there was in a stack of, I think, about a dozen ivory chairbacks that may never have been used. We also have a little stone vessel fragment that shows a scene of tribute bearers. So you can get a sense of who was bringing what to the Assyrian Empire and why. So it's a fascinating story.
One image showed the gems and
Oh, yeah.
necklace. And I started thinking, did they ever find grave sites?
There are grave sites at Kalu, right? And yeah, they did.
They did, yeah. It was Mellon in the 1950s and 1960s uncovered tombs of the royal queens under the site, and they were rich with gold and jewelry. But the necklace that you see is actually comprised of cylinder seals, which would have been individual pieces that were worn as jewelry, but they also had a great functional use.
Right, exactly. So when you see Enid wearing that, that's part of the fascination that happens later with Assyrian art, that they're put together as new kinds of decorations. And we could spend a lot of time. There were manors, Canford, for instance, in England, where they actually made a little Assyrian adjunct to a palace, a British palace, and it was decorated with real Assyrian art. And so there was a way of appropriating and manipulating Assyrian art almost out of context. And so the cylinder seals could be worn, but not probably in the way that you saw in that photo.
Yeah, I also have to share that I love that there was a corresponding male fashion to that. If Enid got to wear the really cool jewelry, men of that time in Europe, some of them adopted what became known as the Assyrian beard, which you recognize from the release. And that characterized, they didn't do the curls. I don't know if anybody could, I don't know how much that was possible, but it actually is a beard that would fall straight down from the chin. And we see this actually in the paintings of Gustave Courbet. So it worked its way into prominent European art as well, known as the Assyrian beard.
Hi, I was wondering if you could speak to the extent to which Assyrian art inspired both ancient Persian and ancient Greek art, and what's kind of the evidence for that, both in artifacts and in historical written documents? And also, what's the extent of Bowdoin's collection? Like, do we have those objects that demonstrate that fusion in especially ancient Persian art?
Jim, did you plant that question?
Yeah, I mean, but Shadi, it's a great question, and again, probably planted it several semesters ago. But but we actually have a prominent part of the exhibition deals with that. So it's what it does is it illustrates what's going on in the Greek and Aegean world, and a little bit in Iran if we move farther to the east. At the same time, the Assyrian state was at its height. As you might remember from the map, the Assyrian Empire extended clear to the Mediterranean, and as a result, it really helped mediate trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus was a vassal state of the Assyrian Empire, and as we saw, it lapped over into southern Turkey. The transformation is extraordinary. In art historical terms, we often refer to a period called the Orientalizing period. The Assyrians have a lot to do with that. And so what I have on display, and we can take a look at them, is I have some of what's going on in Greece in the 8th and 9th centuries, but then how it's radically transformed as a result of this kind of contact. And so it's cuneiform does not catch on in the Greek world. I mean, the Phoenicians have come up with a different and more useful script, and we can talk about that later. But certainly artistic motifs, exotic animals, winged figures, many of the things that we can see in the Assyrian art, even the way the human form is articulated with the very prominent eye, the hint of a grin. There's all these things that smack of Orientalizing and archaic Greek art. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming this evening. And